Hey guys, how are you all beautiful people? Hope all of you are doing fine. And yes, this is next part of Godlike Hokage in Naruto. The Gura Gura no Mi is known as the strongest fruit in the world of One Piece. In Naruto world, the blood limit would grant the strongest power for those ninjas. But what if the Gura Gura no Mi is found in the world of Naruto and after it is eaten it will be like a blood limit power? Well, the MC just took that fruit. This story begins before the Second Ninja War by 2 years. So let's start without any delay. Tsunade. She hesitated a little bit, then she split a small slug out of her and swam to Tsunade's hand. She looked as if she was sensing something. Even with your current power now, you can't practice the Sage Mode. The consequences of practicing it now may be serious. It's best if you wait for more. Tsunade shrugged helplessly, then pointed at Naito, and said, in fact, he's the one who wants to learn it. What? The slug sage got a little surprised, but she didn't say anything. Even though Naito didn't sign a contract with them, she split again and swam to him. Although it's better than the snake, it was still disgusting. Naito's mouth twitched slightly, but he let her land on him. She connected her chakra to Naito's body, and after a little sensing, her expression suddenly changed. The moment the sage slug started to perceive Naito's body, she got a little bit surprised. It's not know how long it has lived, but it has never seen such a physical power like this. Powerful and strong, and it looks like he has a strange hidden power in him. The huge main body of the sage slug turned its head and put its tentacles on Naito's head to carefully sense his power. The moment it touched him, Naito could feel how massive was its chakra. However, compared to Naito's surprise, the slug sage was more shocked. You've managed to awake the human's body limits and gain power far stronger than any ordinary people. Although it hasn't been completed yet, it's very strong. But what is really disturbing is that other strange power. It feels demonic. What is it? Naito was amazed that it could feel the devil fruit power inside him. This power made her kind of terrified. She could sense it, but she couldn't reach its source. In the end, the small slug walked upon his head, and the huge one lifted her tentacles. You have an extraordinary body. I've never seen anything like this. The slug sage pressed down the amazement in its heart, and said, you have a very unique power, and a strong chakra, but I am not sure if you can learn the Sage Mode. What? Tsunade looked at Tsunade with a worried expression, then said, Naito, the risk of practicing the Sage Mode is very high. Even the Sage Slug is not sure if you can do it. You better not. Naito smiled, then he directly interpreted Tsunade, saying, rest reassured, I will be very careful, and we don't know if I can until I try it. After he said this, Naito looked up to the slug sage and said, can you tell me the practicing method of the Sage Mode? Of course. Naito was amazed. He didn't expect her to tell him how to practice it without signing a blood contract. Naito was originally ready to do it. Although he wasn't interested in summoning these slugs, Naito was ready to do anything to learn their method. Soon, the slug sage started to explain the method to Naito while she was carefully watching him. How many years it lived. It's an immortal ancient creature, that way before the days of the Sixth Paths, witnessing the entire history of this world. But it never saw anyone like Naito. Someday this human will change the world. The sage slug couldn't help but whisper these words to itself. After he learned their methods, Naito returned to Konoha with Tsunade and didn't choose to practice it in the Shikotsu forest. And this surprised Tsunade. After all, that forest was full of spiritual energy. No doubt that it should be more convenient to practice it there under the guidance of the slug sage. Tsunade couldn't help but explain this to Naito on their trip. Still, Naito smiled to her gently and refused. On the way back to the village, Tsunade didn't stop warning Naito time after time, asking him to be careful and not rush things. Naito kept nodding at her thoughtfully. Naito knew that she was just worried about him, however, he was confident about his control over chakra. The probabilities of failing are too small. He also didn't mention that he was gonna study the other methods too, and finally come out with a better suitable sage mode for him. To put it bluntly, Naito was more interested in creating a sage mode like the one Hashirama had. He has always felt that it was the perfect sage mode. Naito's best ninjutsu line research was without any doubt still Orochimaru, but he didn't want to illuminate any more paths for him. The research he did on the soul enhancement was something he was already studying. You won't know what will Orochimaru do if he gets his hands on the 3 methods of cultivation, the sage mode. Naito should always be careful around him. The Mount Myoboku method is the most simple. All that you need to do is to stand still, be calm to the extreme, and sense the existence of the natural energy around you, and absorb it. However, although it was the most simple, it was also the most difficult to do. Naito kept studying the 3 methods, and repeatedly tried to figure out a way to connect the 3 of them to create his own way. However, it wasn't a simple thing to do. It has already passed a month since he came back from the Shikotsu forest, yet Naito didn't make any progress. On the contrary, within this month, Naito made new progress in terms of physical power. Although he was studying the sage mode for a month, he never stopped training his body. Naito was still using the added weight technique to assist him with his training. Actually, this progress was directly related to the added weight technique. Earth release, super added weight technique. The back hills of Konoha. A loud sound came out, and the ground under Naito's foot collapsed as there was a terrifying crack spreading densely around. The whole place was trembling. Even this extremely hard ground couldn't withstand this super heavyweight technique. Yes, this month, Naito discovered a way to upgrade the added weight technique. This was to the enhancement Naito gain in his soul. It made his control over chakra stronger, which made Naito's talent in ninjutsu increase. As a result, even if the earth property wasn't Naito's true nature of chakra, it became perfectly controlled by him. With this technique, even if Naito still wasn't ready to practice the sage mode, he will eventually. Naito estimates that his body strength will be at least doubled twice if he keeps training using this new technique. After that, even if his body strength wasn't up to the standards for opening the 6th gate, he expects that it won't be that far behind. Humph. Humph. This upgraded version of the added weight technique wasn't the same as the ordinary one. Even when Naito was trying to reduce the output of the chakra to weakening the power of the technique, still the pressure was still terrifying. Naito could barely stand still, but he will never give up. Naito made an oath that he will never break, an oath that he will be the strongest, and as long as he was still breathing, Naito will never break. Naito resumed his life, studying the sage mode, and living his joyful daily life with Kushina, while he kept this technique always activated, thinking that this will last forever. But after half a month, Naito suddenly got unexpected information. The assassin ninja Blood Hand appeared again in the black market with the Kusanagi sword. Naito kept searching for him since the end of the Second World War, however, he couldn't get his hand on any useful information. All of a sudden, the Blood Hand suddenly popped out. Such an unexpected and surprising event. Moreover, he didn't find this information in the black market, it was actually in Konoha. The Blood Hand appeared in the Land of Fire to do an assassination mission. And succeeded. The man assassinated the fire daimyo. Although he always has some shinobi guarding him, yet no one will try to kill a daimyo, because they are only ordinary people. For example, if the land lightning sends some ninjas to assassinate the fire daimyo, the others will just do the same. It's a lose-lose to both sides. Therefore, even if war breaks out, the only people who will be fighting are the ninjas. These daimyo will not be dragged to the battlefield. After he killed daimyo of the fire, the Blood Hand killed 3 more shinobis from Konoha, but one of them managed to put a secret mark on his body. A tracking mark. Therefore, after the village got the news, they sent a team of Anbu after him. Naito couldn't help but notice these Anbu team leaving the village in a hurry, so he got curious. Although Naito is not allowed access to the Anbu intelligence, yet he went there and read the whole thing anyway. No one will stop him after all, including the Hokage himself. He assassinated the daimyo fire. This is unexpected. Is the wind and lightning behind this? Naito touched his chin and walked out of the Anbu, whispering these words to himself. Killing a daimyo won't be difficult for anyone, but after that, you will have to face the rage of a whole land. He must be really confident to irritate a big village like Konoha. They will never stop before they find him. After he obtained this information, Naito left the Konoha following the direction of the Anbu. Naito didn't care about the daimyo, he was only interested in the Kusanagi sword. It was a must-have thing to him. After endless searching, Naito confirmed that there is only 3 Kusanagi swords. The day he put his hand on the second one, Naito felt a bit of connection between the two. If he gets the third one, there should be some special effect. This sword seems to be lost a long time ago. The sand has only snatched 2 from the hand of the Kusanagi clan. After wandering around the borders of Land of Fire for a long time, Naito couldn't find any traces of the Blood Hand. Naito went back to the Land of Fire. He had a feeling that his man will be smart enough to think that the safest place will be inside of the country since everyone will think he already left. However, it wasn't long before the Anbu team finally found him. And the result was surprising. Konoha has actually sent 2 special squads after him, a total of 8 fine Anbu. It doesn't sound much for Naito. He could end their life with one cut out of his sword. But this man has actually managed to kill 4 of them and escaped again. However, the information said that the Blood Hand has also got injured. Still, this is amazing. Even the high-level people in Konoha were shocked, and they were ready to send Sakumo to deal with him. However, at this time, a sentence from Naito made the remaining team retreat and return to Konoha. Leave it to me. With such a simple sentence, the Anbu returned to Konoha, and the village dispatched the other team they were preparing to send with Sakumo. After all, a man like Naito didn't need any support. Because they knew it was already over, the moment Naito decided to deal with him. Naito kept chasing the Blood Hand. With his speed he can reach his current position in just a few days. But the Blood Hand was moving, and he should be hiding after he took rid of that Anbu team. If you think about it, this sounds amazing. This ninja is not an average guy, he should be at the level of a Hokage. And with the Kusanagi sword abilities, he should be even stronger. Half a month later, in a forest. Naito kept tracking the Blood Hand at the beginning based on the information he got from Konoha's pursuit. When he got closer to him, the 2 Kusanagi swords held by Naito start to give him some kind of induction on the direction of the third one. Although it was still weak, yet it was better than chasing him based on this information because some of them were fake ones left by the Blood Hand. Tracking this weak induction, Naito finally found the Blood Hand. He was in this forest, and he was on the move, but because Naito got really close, he could sense his position with his ultra perceive. Whoosh! Whoosh! Naito moved so fast in the forest using his full speed. Naito was holding his Kusanagi sword, chasing the blood hand not from the treetops, but on the ground, since it was the fastest way. Most of the ninjas use the treetops to reduce their traces since it's easier to leave footprints on the ground, and normally most ninjas focus more on hidden their trails. Naito didn't care about hiding his traces, he was moving forward while his ultra perceive is fully opened, nothing could stop him, even the trees ahead blocking the road, he was just cutting them using his Kusanagi sword while flashing past them. Blood Hand seemed to be fast, but he was nothing compared to Naito. Finally, after a while, he entered the range of Naito's ultra perceive. However, at this time, Blood Hand suddenly stopped. He didn't only stop running forward, but he rushed toward Naito instead. The Blood Hand's face was pale, but he wasn't scared. It seems that this was the original color of his skin. But when you look closely, his arms are all white. Just as he was ready to attack, Naito suddenly speeded up. Through. This speed was obviously unexpected for Blood Hand. The original speed of Naito was shocking enough, but this has really stunned him. Blood release. In a second, Naito directly flashed in front of him. Whoosh! Suddenly, blood splattered, and his body got split into two halves. What? He just cut him into two halves, but Naito was the one who got surprised. The two halves fell on the ground, then turned into two pools of blood. Just as he was surprised by this turn in the event, the blood suddenly surged, and turned into two liquefied figures and rushed toward Naito. Blood release. So this is how he got his nickname. This world is full of strange abilities, some people can even use their bones, so it's only normal to find someone who can use blood. But these two figures are just blood, nothing special about them, but still, it made Naito more cautious. A release that has never been seen is always dangerous. The unknown is equal to danger. Therefore, Naito didn't hold back this time and used his fist to shatter it into pieces. Boom! The air burst and the two figures got smashed. The impact made a strange sound, and the two figures turned back into ordinary blood. What kind of chakra nature is this? It seems strange. Naito kept looking at the blood on the ground, then he shook his head while his eyes became sharp. After he smashed these two figures with his fist, the blood on the ground didn't move again. Naito frowned, then he used his ultra perceive to look around. It turned out to be a clone. In the distance, in a small river, the water suddenly surged, and a person raised from the sea, revealing a terrified look on his face. Damn, my blood clone got easily destroyed. Is this the guy called the God of Shinobi? I need to. An abrupt sound suddenly came and interrupted Blood Hand from finishing his sentence. Out of nowhere, Naito flashed in front of him and slammed him with a punch. The Blood Hand got hit and couldn't help but get terrified. What kind of speed is that? He was just over there, how did he come here so fast? A cloning technique, you really fooled me there, it's really difficult to see through your blood release. Naito looked calm at him. In fact, this trick will never work again on him, unless he's willing to leave the Kusanagi sword behind, there's no way to escape. Naito was chasing him relying on the inductions he was feeling from it. No one has ever seen through my bloodline limit. The Blood Hand slowly suppressed the horror he was feeling in his heart, and a cold stare appeared in his eyelids, then he suddenly moved his hand. This was a hand sign. Naito was prepared to destroy anything he was gonna throw at him with a punch, but this wasn't an attacking technique. 1 second later, the Blood Hand's body got healed. What? Naito got really surprised watching the blood movements in his body. Interesting. Upon seeing this, Naito moved his hand, sending a shock wave toward him to interrupt this strange movement of his blood. The Blood Hand revealed a sneer expression in front of Naito as if he was watching a dead. Suddenly, a ground suddenly appeared in his hand, and in a second a golden streamer got unleashed out of the jar and headed toward Naito. Whoosh! A golden light suddenly appeared, like a meteor cutting through the sky. In an instant, it came in front of Naito. Naito knew that this was the unconventional form of the Totsuka sword, which has the power to seal enemies that hits. However, Naito wasn't afraid. He also had the power that can even break the gates of heaven. But at the last moment, looking at that golden streamer heading toward him, Naito suddenly hesitated and stopped. Whoosh! Suddenly, the golden streamer ran through Naito's body. Looking at this scene, a hint of mockery appeared on the Blood Hand's face. So this is the so-called god of shinobi, how embarrassing. You're just like the other Konoha's shinobis from before, ha 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 ha. He was confident in his Totsuka sword seal power, but he thought that Naito will try to do something against it. He didn't expect Naito to get hit directly from the first strike. He didn't even try to dodge it. The Blood Hand looked at Naito, who had the golden light running inside him, and couldn't help but laugh loudly. Suddenly the atmosphere instantly became strange, and the sound of his laugh stopped. Suddenly, the expression on his face stagnated, then the cold sweat appeared on his forehead. What is this? The Blood Hand was holding the gourd in his hand, which allowed him to extend or shrink the blade of the Totsuka sword at will. All that he needed to do is to control the sword to seal Naito in the gourd. But no matter how many times he tried, the blade wasn't moving, and he couldn't seal Naito back in the gourd. Naito's body seemed as if it was a giant peak nailed to the ground, that it's impossible to shake him. However, this is not supposed to happen. The Totsuka sword had this unique ability to seal the enemy that gets hit by its blade. It never failed. How could a person be able to resist its seal after getting hit? The Blood Hand wasn't a fool. He knew that something was wrong. Do you think that the Kusanagi sword will seal his own maker? Naito looked calmly at the poor guy with a slight taunt in his eyes. He simply didn't try to avoid it, because he didn't need to. Naito reached out the blade inserted in his chest and slammed it. Suddenly the Blood Hand felt an irresistible power forcing him, and he could no longer hold the gourd of the Totsuka sword. Suddenly, it flew out of his hand, and came to Naito's side. What? The blade got retracted inside the gourd, while Naito's body didn't even have a trace of wounds. The Totsuka sword had the power to seal enemies, but at the moment it hit Naito's body it didn't hurt him. Instead, it directly established a new connection with Naito. The Totsuka sword already belonged to Naito. Based on the amount of the chakra injected in the gourd, the blade of the sword will change its size. Actually, the first Kusanagi sword Naito obtained had the same effect. The golden gourd trembled gently in Naito's hand, revealing its joy. This scene made the Blood Hand freeze in his place. He let the blade of the Totsuka sword hit his body so he could win it to himself. Is this a joke? The Blood Hand felt as if he was dreaming. If Naito blocked that hit or dodged, he wouldn't be this shocked. He didn't even think that this is possible. The moment he put his hand on the Totsuka sword, Naito started to feel a strange activity between it and the other two swords. Finally got the last one. Looking at the gourd in his hand, Naito felt emotional as he whispered these words lightly. He didn't take out the other sword immediately to see the effect, Wasn't the end of the fight, after all. Instead, he raised his hand and looked directly to the blood hand. Thank you for holding this one for so long, and for bringing it to me. Naito was in a good mood. After he smiled at him, holding the Totsuka sword, he injected his chakra into it. Impossible. This is impossible. He was still unable to accept this fact. The expression on the blood hand's face was incredible. The moment he saw the Totsuka sword pointed at him, his heart suddenly started shaking in fear. Then he suddenly looked like he realized something. The Totsuka sword. He held this sword for a long time, and he understands its abilities. He actually used it several times on other people. He knew that there was no way to fight against it. His heart sank in fear. He had no will to resist it, or fight against it. In an instant, he printed a hand sign with one hand. Then the whole person turned into blood, and tried to head toward the riverside. But in the next moment, the golden light ran through him before he could even reach the river. No. The blood once again condensed into a human form, but the whole person looked stunned. His face showed deep desperation. He always relied on the power of this sword. He defeated many enemies using it. He never thought that he will have the same fate as those people he defeated. The blood hand's voice stopped abruptly, and with a hint of desperation on his face, his whole body got melted, then sucked into the gold in Naito's hand. The golden light finally faded away into the gold and disappeared. The Totsuka sword doesn't have an actual blade. The gold was the essence of its power. Puff. Puff. The white smoke appeared, and the two Kusanagi swords came out at will in front of Naito. Then they directly suspended in the air while the gold of the Totsuka sword was still in Naito's hand. Finally, the three Kusanagi swords are all gathered together. The three Kusanagi swords got naturally suspended in front of Naito. It seemed as if there was a magnetic field between them. If Naito didn't just force the gold to get back to his hand, they would have collided directly. When he had the two Kusanagi swords before, he felt some connection between them, but now after he got the third one, that connection got stronger. Naito let the two other Kusanagi swords float in the air, while he took the third to study it carefully. The Totsuka sword had the ability to seal the enemies, but after it seals them, what happens to them? If you break this gold, will these enemies get released? This is what he was thinking about, but Naito wasn't gonna do it. After all of this hard work he put into collecting them all, Naito was just trying to understand the composition of the Totsuka sword. The sword has established a new connection with Naito. The Totsuka sword had its own consciousness. It could convey some of its emotions to Naito. However, it wasn't really a living thing. Its awareness was so simple, it's not even comparable to some small animals. But this was good enough. Actually, was amazing, a magical thing. It's as if it's connected to Naito's own soul. Perhaps the sword wasn't just sealing enemies into the gold, maybe it was also refining the user's soul. Whom? The three swords were trembling as if they were begging Naito to let them go. After he kept looking at the Totsuka sword in his hand, he finally did. Ding! The moment he let go of the sword, it suddenly flew out, and the other two Kusanagi swords reached over and got directly sucked into the gold as if they got sealed into it. This scene was kind of confusing to Naito. Naito didn't even know how to release the sealed things inside the gourd, and now it actually eats the two other swords. Suddenly, a strange wave of ripples broke out. The moment the Totsuka sword swallowed the two other Kusanagi swords, it conveyed a hungry thought to Naito. The former felt extraordinary energy at that moment around the Totsuka sword. To be more accurate, it wasn't strange to Naito. Natural energy. The Totsuka sword can actually absorb the natural energy itself. This change in the event made Naito stunned. He couldn't help but keep looking at the sword and how it was absorbing the natural energy. The gourd kept absorbing the energy, but something seemed different about it. It wasn't just absorbing it, the energy was actually blending with the sword. Moreover, the Totsuka sword awareness after it swallowed the two other Kusanagi swords got even stronger. After long scrutiny, Naito finally realized it. It turns out that these three swords are originally one. Looking at the Totsuka sword in the air floating and constantly absorbing natural energy, Naito couldn't help but whisper these words. The purpose of the Kusanagi clan to forge these swords wasn't so they can be separated, but to make a magical weapon, one that can be as strong as the Sixth Path's weapons. However, the Kusanagi clan weren't the ancestors of the Sixth Path, and they didn't have that kind of power. It was impossible for them to forge such a weapon directly. Therefore, they tried another method, which forced them to separate these swords. The Totsuka sword was the root, so they gave it the power to seal enemies. It kept absorbing the energy contained from the sealed enemies one after another. Only after absorbing enough energy, the three swords will be fused together, and make this unique magical weapon. The sword was strong enough, but now after adding the natural energy, it doesn't even need to rely on the strength of its master. Its power is enough to be as strong as the treasured tools of the Sage of Six Paths. The gourd continued on absorbing the natural energy. Naito knew that it was brewing it inside, which means that the transformation of the new sword didn't finish, so he wasn't worried about it. After a little bit of perceiving, Naito determined that this process could take a month. Because it was absorbing the natural energy all the time, its size becomes really big, and Naito wasn't ready to take it back to the village, because it may cause him some trouble. Therefore, Naito found a temporary place to live nearby. When the Totsuka sword was absorbing the natural energy, Naito could feel some fluctuations which he has never seen before. Naito tried to perceive the existence of natural energy several times before, but it was too difficult for him since he couldn't reach the state where he can moderate his shock force, and focus on natural energy. What Naito didn't expect was that when the Totsuka sword started observing natural energy, he could sense its flow with his ultra perceive. After he closed his eyes, the world became entirely different under his ultra perceive. The ground, the sky, the trees, the grass, everything was filled with natural energy. So this is natural energy. Naito's eyes were closed, but his face showed a hint of exclamation. No matter how you think about it, natural energy was always a mystery to him. However, Naito didn't know if he would still be able to sense it after the sword stops absorbing it. Therefore, Naito sat next to the Totsuka sword and began to work on the natural energy norms. His goal was to make his ultra perceive able to sense it even in a normal state. After some hard work, Naito finally succeeded. When Naito's shock force reached the 5th stage, his ultra perceive induction got upgraded. However, after he worked on his soul and strengthened it a lot, the ultra perceive grew even stronger. The ultra perceive is, after all, a sensory ability, and the sensory abilities are generally linked to mental power, which makes it also linked to the soul. The stronger the soul, the stronger the perception will naturally be. It took almost a half month of hard work to enhance the ultra perceive induction. Finally, Naito could sense natural energy. Even when he was so far away from the Totsuka sword, he was still able to sense the flow of the natural energy. It became to him as clear as watching the sky. In the past, it was impossible for him. It was like fishing in the desert. It was difficult to perceive its flow, but now Naito can feel it from all directions. Moreover, through the process, The world in his Ultra Perceive has also upgraded. It was no longer black and white. Naito has finally managed to add colors. The natural energy itself enhances the perception of the user. In the original, it doesn't only enhance the speed and strength, but it also gave the user the ability to sense his surroundings better. Naito still didn't start practicing the Sage Mode, but after he could sense the natural energy, it seems that he could control it slightly. By controlling it, Naito could make a combination between his Ultra Perceive and natural energy to finally open up a new world. Without practicing the Sage Mode, Naito became able to control the natural energy, which it was an ability Naito discovered on his own. The shock force also has an effect on natural energy. Naito could control natural energy, and change its flow by shocking the surrounding air. The miniaturization of this process became a method to control natural energy. Naito has actually discovered a way to control the natural energy directly. The problems he had before with blending it within his own chakra were finally solved. Naito had already an idea of the Sage Mode he seeks, but he got stuck on a threshold of not being able to sense the natural energy, which made him unable to control it. But now, Naito has finally passed that threshold. The moment he solved that problem, everything went smoothly. After he managed to sense the flow of natural energy, Naito realized that everything in this world has its own fluctuations. Even if it's too weak, using natural energy, he could detect its existence through the fluctuations it's creating. This way, Naito managed to add colors into his world of perception. After the combined natural energy with his Ultra Perceive, Naito seemed to be able to have a connection with every object within the scope of his perception. Faintly, he seemed even able to perceive the essence of the objects themselves. Naito has finally created his own Sage Mode. It didn't possess the same characteristics as Jiraiya and Naruto, nor the ones with Kabuto. It was a unique new one. If he wanted to follow the same path Naruto did, or if he wanted to learn the Snake's Sage Mode, Naito would have eventually learned it. However, Naito's heart has never felt like being restricted to a single path. That's why Naito continued his researches. He never gave up. He was ready to go all the way. Of course, the Sage Mode Naito has created wasn't perfect. It was just a prototype. It was risky to practice it directly. In the following time, Naito began to try little by little to make this prototype perfect, and more suitable for him. Finally, with a complete understanding of natural energy and this new method, he finally started practicing the Sage Mode. Through his Ultra Perceive, Naito determined the flow of the natural energy and started to absorb it. The idea was to use his shocks to force the natural energy out of his body if it goes out of control. It's like the time when Naruto was learning the Sage Mode in the original. Fukasaku was using a big black stick to hit him and knock the natural energy out of his body. On the contrary to Naruto, Naito didn't need a stick. The shock force can knock the natural energy out of Naito's body at will. Therefore, the risks of practicing the Sage Mode were almost reduced to zero. As long as he's careful, there won't be any problems. In the original, Naruto had a tremendous amount of chakra, and he also a special oil to assist him sensing the flow of the natural energy. There's also Fukasaku who was teaching him and giving him excellent guidance, but he needed to learn the Sage Mode in a brief period. In comparison, Naito's chakra was also significant. It was above the level of Hokage. Moreover, Naito has an advantage over Naruto. That is, Naruto needs to absorb the natural energy step by step through a sit-in so he could sense its flow, while Naito could detect it with his Ultra Perceive, control it, and even absorb it while he's in a moving state. This Sage Mode was created by Naito, and it belonged to him alone. Therefore, even the cultivation method was completely different. Naito wasn't absorbing the energy naturally, but he was forcibly controlling it. Naito didn't know precisely how long it took Naruto to learn the Sage Mode. 1 week. 1 month. 3 months. The period wasn't definite in the original, but Naito himself succeeded in learning the Sage Mode in only 10 days. It sounds incredible, but it's actually normal. It's even slightly slower for Naito. Because the most challenging thing about it was being able to sense the flow of the natural energy, and how to control it. These two difficult steps were crossed directly by Naito. The only thing left was to make the energy blend with his own chakra. Whoosh! The natural energy was constantly surging. A large amount of it was coming from the Totsuka sword, while a small part of it was absorbed by Naito, who was sitting next to it. The natural energy and the chakra were perfectly blending. Suddenly, faint red dots started looming around Naito's eyebrow. These red dots gradually became red marks around and under his eyes, just like Hashirama had before. Naito has finally awakened his own Sage Mode. When it became utterly stable, Naito finally opened his eyes. With the Sage Mode, speed, strength, and defense have increased by a small amount. The physical fitness has improved a lot. The shock force should be stronger, but it's necessary to open the 6th gate for it to reach the 6th stage. Naito opened his eyes and tried to sense his physical condition. Later, he stood up and looked at his hands as he clenched them, making fists. Naito was prepared to experiment with his new strength. He went straight to a mountain and swung out his fist. Boom! In an instant, the whole mountain got destroyed, and the forest behind disappeared completely. Although the growth is not too big, it still counts as an improvement. Unfortunately, this early stage of the Sage Mode won't help me opening the 6th gate. Knight kept looking at his fist, then he took it back and sighed. What he cultivated was a Sage Mode that only belongs to him. Because he could absorb the natural energy in movement, his Sage Mode could always be turned on. The shock force doesn't consume a lot of chakra, so even while he's in battle the consumption of the natural energy won't be large. It can almost be said that Naito has a permanent Sage Mode. Of course, the Sage Mode is not the real purpose of Naito. What he wants to achieve is Hashirama's Sage Mode. The one that can be called a truly eternal Sage Mode. Only that level can satisfy Naito. The one he has achieved, although it seems permanent, it's still different. The Sage Mode that Naito has currently is just like the one Naruto had in the original. It's just more perfect than him because Naito could take full control of it. Naito called this one the first stage of the Sage Mode. It can only be achieved if you could absorb the natural energy and merge it with your own chakra. Even if Naito can maintain it forever, it will not be the same thing as Hashirama's. The one Hashirama achieved was a perfect model of the Sage Mode, and Naito classified it as the 2nd stage. The body's cell itself will be blended with the natural energy until the body itself began to regenerate the natural energy. Therefore, Hashirama could easily activate the Sage Mode even when he was moving, without any kind of limitations. This kind of Sage Mode will grant you an immortal body, but not everyone could achieve it. It seems that only the successors of Ashura can, but Naito believes that he still can reach that level with training. No one has stood in the sky from the beginning, even the 6th path. Everything has a starting point. Even Kaguya was just a normal human being before she eats from the God Tree. What Naito needs to do is to keep the hard work, and step by step, he will also reach that sky, where those people are standing. The 2nd stage of the Sage Mode grants the body of immortals. It dramatically increases the speed of the strength, but it also has the ability to heal its user, without even the need of a seal. It's even more perfect than the one he has now. The most challenging thing about it is the way to blend the natural energy with the body's cells to transform it. After a long time of thinking, Naito finally got the answer. The reverse Hakemon Tonku can do this. He will only need to integrate the natural energy into the 5 gates that have been opened in his body, and the natural energy will gradually merge with it and transform Naito's body. This will no longer be considered as the first stage of the Sage Mode. This will grant him a permanent transformation for his own cells, which will gradually get spread through his whole body. Of course, the speed of this process will be slow. For Naito, this was a leap of faith. He finally felt relieved. As long as he achieves the body of Sage, he will be able to open the 6th gate. Now, all that he needs is to keep the natural energy within him and control it all the time to let it gradually merge in his cells and slowly transform his body. Of course, even if he tries to absorb more natural energy, the progress won't improve, especially in the beginning. It's really difficult to directly integrate it into his cells, and it will all get wasted. I finally found the right path to open the 6th gate, only the 7th and 8th remains. How will I open it? Will I need to find to reach a 3rd stage of the Sage Mode? Sensing the situation in his body, the blood was constantly getting pumped, driving the natural energy with it, gradually blending it with his body, and slowly transforming it. After the 2nd stage, there is a 3rd one. The 3rd stage can no longer be considered as a Sage Mode after that. It will have a new name. 6th Path Mode. This mode is named after the 6th path, so it is called the 6th Path Mode. In the original, Madara, who became the Jinchuriki of the Gyuubi, gained a much stronger immortal body than Hashirama and achieved the 6th Path Mode. Even when he got hit by Guy's last blow, he didn't die, although Madara himself said he nearly killed him. Half of his body was gone, but he could quickly recover it. If he was only in the 2nd stage, I am afraid it will be difficult for him to survive. At this speed, it will take me more than 10 years to achieve the body of the immortal. But step by step, while I am working on the reverse Hakemon Tonku, it may take me much lesser than 10 years to achieve it. Naito stood and started to analyze the situation. As he was still observing the flow of the natural energy in his body, and thinking about what he needed to do next. The Totsuka sword next to him suddenly stopped absorbing the natural energy. Naito felt a little bit scared. In the more than a month period the sword was absorbing natural energy. Because the amount was too big. The speed and the amount of natural energy were really terrifying. And this didn't just last for a short period of time, it actually kept going for more than a month. Then it suddenly stopped. The silence was controlling the place. When Totsuka's sword stopped the consumption of the natural energy, everything calmed down for a moment, which let even Naito stop his cultivation and stare at the gourd floating in the air. Suddenly a crack appeared on the golden gourd. Crack. The crisp sound seemed like if it was the sound of an eggshell breaking. The crack continued on spreading around until it finally covered the whole gourd. Boom! The gourd of the Totsuka sword burst open along with an earth-shattering roar. At that moment, it seemed as if there was a floating golden sun blooming in the air, with a dazzling bright light that blinded Naito's vision for a moment. Along with it, a terrible force burst out, destroying the ground around it. However, with a simple move from Naito's hand, that force suddenly got blocked from spreading away. Still, the impact bombarded the mountains around the place. Along with this force, a massive amount of natural energy burst out and got loose. Apparently, it was some of the energy that the sword couldn't absorb at the end of the process. However, Naito wasn't gonna let that big amount get waste. in a second he forced it into his body and absorbed it, letting it flow directly into the first gate of the reverse Hakimon Tonku, the gate of heart. The amount of the natural energy he just absorbed was comparable to the amount he absorbed in this whole month. Naito couldn't help but get surprised. But this wasn't the right time to pay attention to minor things. He directly raised his head and looked in the direction of the gourd. The gourd of the Totsuka sword was destroyed entirely, while something was glowing in the distance. It should be the new weapon, the one that was created from the fusion of the 3 Kusanagi sword. The golden light slowly started to fade away. Naito got shocked just from the first glance he took on the new weapon. Because it didn't look like any regular sword, nor like one of the previous Kusanagi sword. It was a strange golden ball of light. However, this light ball didn't get an illusory feeling from it, it was as if it was formed from glass. And he could feel a faint connection between the two of them. With one thought, the golden light ball flew into Naito's hand. Holding it, Naito felt as if it was created from chakra, very similar to the Susanoo. However, it not only chakra but also he could feel the natural energy in it, so its existence itself was strange and unique from anything in this world. Looking at this golden light ball, Naito suddenly thought about something. Maybe it can be transformed into anything. Maybe a sword. At the same moment, the ball suddenly flashed in Naito's hand, and in accordance with Naito's thought, it turned into a long golden sword. It really has the ability to change to anything you want. Naito looked amazed and slightly surprised. It can change to anything. This new sword is undoubtedly far better than the previous Kusanagi swords. Perhaps it should be called Shinseia sword, T/N, Shinseia, rebirth. With this ability, it can change its shape to anything. It can even become a shield or a long spear. And it can be extended in and out at will, or it can even turn into long chains wrapped around Naito's hand. The defensive power is really strong. I really didn't expect it to be this good. Such an artifact is indeed qualified to be as strong as the Sixth Path's ancient weapons. With one thought from Naito, the Shinseia sword turned into its original shape. The god in this world is actually the Sixth Path. This new Kusanagi sword really has the power of a god. However, Naito does not know whether it can be compared to the truth-seeking ball, but since it's created from natural energy, even if it faces it, it won't be easily defeated. And since it's a purely energy-oriented type weapon, its power is actually related to the users. If the user is strong enough, it might even help find the path to the Sixth Path's power. However, these were just Naito's expectations. He was still testing it. Looking at the golden light ball, Naito was finally ready to really test it. Let's see your true power. At will, the golden ball in Naito's hands turned into a huge hammer. Naito held it in his hand, then he flashed in the distance. Although it looked big, it was very light, he couldn't even feel its weight. At the next moment, with the hammer in his hand, Naito slammed the mountain in front of him. A hammer is actually the most suitable form for Naito to use along with his shock force. Boom! For a moment, he seemed as if he slammed the sky itself. The whole place was shaking as the horrible force of shock has burst out. The mountains below got completely shattered, and the ground burst with countless cracks, and in an instant, it collapsed. Bang! In the end, the whole place collapsed entirely from the impact of this hit and turned into a huge pit. The pit looked huge, the same size as the entire Woodleaf village. With Naito's full force, this simple move has already reached the same level as the terrible power of Pain's Shinra Tensei. Actually, in terms of power, it looked even stronger. The Shinra Tensei indeed destroyed the whole village, yet many people survived, but Naito's attack will destroy the whole place with every living thing in it. Even the smallest ant on the ground won't survive. Using this weapon makes the power of the shock even greater than using simply my fists. Even the range has become wider. Falling from the sky slowly into the ground, Naito looked at the big bottomless pit he made, and he couldn't help but feel amazed. Suddenly, the golden hammer melted and shrunk, then finally turned into a pair of golden gauntlets set on Naito's fists. Afterward, Naito looked carefully at the bottom and focused his full power, and slammed it out. Boom! Naito's targeted the deep pit with his attack, which made it collapse from its edges. The hole got more in depth, but the range of this attack wasn't as good as before, but because of that, the power was more significant. The walls inside the pit kept collapsing as the hole was getting deeper and deeper until the falling rocks suddenly fell into the groundwater veins, causing the water to flow out. What? The water kept flowing out of the pit until the whole jungle got turned into a vast lake. After he kept testing his new weapon, Naito didn't do anything about the mess that he made. Instead, he just shrugged and turned away. The new Kusanagi sword can change its shape at will. When it's not injected with the chakra of the user, it keeps its initial form as a lightning glass ball. The moment it's infused with chakra, it will change its form. The bigger it gets, the more chakra it consumes. If you want to make a huge shield, you will need a significant amount of chakra to do so. Although he learned the Sage mode and his chakra improved magnificently, it's still just 2 levels above the Hokage's level. Naito will need to improve it even more, at least to the level of the likes of Hashirama, so he could reach the 2nd level of the Sage mode, the body of the immortal, and open the 6th gate of the reverse Hakemon Tonku. However, the new Kusanagi sword is really amazing. The higher the chakra amount, the stronger the attack of this weapon will get. It's simple, but also strong, and anyone can use it. It's a pity that the people who actually made this weapon didn't live to see it. If Naito didn't work hard to collect all the 3 weapons together, this weapon would have been disappeared completely in the long river of history. Naito did no longer need to seal the sword as before. All that he needed to do is one thought to make the weapon shrink and turn into a golden ring that he can wear on his finger. As long as he keeps it in on his finger, all that he needs to do is to inject his chakra into that ring to make it change its shape again and turn to anything he wants. Naito was delighted with the new Kusanagi sword. Naito left that area and headed directly toward the village. He chased the Blood Hand for so long until he was already at the borders of the Land of Fire. However, this distance was nothing to Naito. Under his full speed he managed to cover a lot of distance with one step, and since his Sage mode was permanently activated, he didn't even need to eat. In the original, Naruto needed to eat bugs to survive his training, but not Naito. Since he was blending the natural energy with his cells, the results were completely different. The path Naruto followed in the original had no ways of improvements. If he weren't the successor of Ashura and awakened the power of the 6th paths, it would have been impossible for him to cross over the 2nd stage and reach that level directly. The path that Naito has followed was completely different. Combining the natural energy with his reverse Hakemon Tonku will eventually lead him to awake the 2nd stage of the Sage mode. All the way forward, Naito was moving at high speed without even the need to use the Super Sru technique. And because of this he couldn't help but think about it. My speed has improved a lot, but I am not sure if it can be compared to the Flying Thunder God while using the Super Sru technique. Naito muttered this to himself. He couldn't help but think about Minato since he didn't know whether he has learned the Flying Thunder God technique yet. The Flying Thunder God is a space ninjutsu, The user only needs a kunai or an actual seal on any subject to instantly teleport toward it. The Flying Thunder technique doesn't require any kind of hand signs, with just a thought it can be activated. However, the emergence of that thought also takes time. In the short distance, Minato will need to locate a position first so he could teleport toward. In the process, Naito can reach that location first before him. It can be said that in short distances, Naito's speed can be comparable to the Flying Thunder technique and in some situations even faster. Of course, the Flying Thunder God can ignore the distance as long as there's a seal near it, and once the distance becomes longer, even if Naito reaches the speed of light, it will be impossible for him to catch up with the speed of space. Naito didn't have the intention of beating a space technique in long distance since the sound of that only is ridiculous. Constantly advancing, Naito focused more on the vibrations of natural energy in the air. With his Ultra Perceive, he kept absorbing natural energy while moving. Just as he was heading back, Naito suddenly noticed an extraordinary mountain in the distance. The mountain range was incredibly vast, even with his Ultra Perceive he could only sense a small part of it. And what was more strange is that he could sense a significant increase in the density of natural energy in there. The more he went deeper into the mountain, the more natural energy he found. After discovering this strange mountain, Naito couldn't help but go deeper into it. The amount of natural energy in that place really attracted Naito's attention. As he gradually approached it, the mystery of this mountain gradually unveiled, and Naito finally recognized the place. Mount Myoboku. It's the place where Naruto practiced his sage mode in the original. It's also the habitat of the frogs. The outer periphery of Mount Myoboku was more complicated than Shikotsu Forest. It was mentioned in the original that it's impossible to enter the mount without knowing its secret roads. The outside is like a labyrinth. In general, the ninjas are always able to determine their location and find the right paths. A maze won't stop a true ninja from reaching his target, especially if he's a perceptive ninja. However, when Naito went deeper into the mountain, he understood what they meant by calling it a maze. It's impossible to reach the inside of Mount Myoboku not only because of the maze but also because of the rich natural energy inside it. Its strange power interferes with people's awareness and strays them. With this huge amount of natural energy, even a perceptual ninja will find it hard to find the right path toward the inside of the mountain. There are 4 ways to enter Mount Myoboku. First, by the reversed summon technique, which can only be activated if you signed a contract with the toads. Second, by forcibly opening your way into the inside of the mountain and destroying the whole place. Third, with activating the sage mode and absorbing natural energy, which will block its interferences on the user's awareness. Fourth, by using the special secret road. For Naito, besides the first one, he could use any of the other 3 ways. It might interfere with the awareness of ordinary people, but the moment he activates the Ultra Perceive it's ineffective. Under Naito's Ultra Perceive, the whole area was clear to him. He could even locate the secret road, yet he didn't use it because he was simply lazy. The moment he stepped into the maze, the natural energy started to interfere with his awareness. However, before it could even reach him, the natural energy was forcibly controlled by Naito and directly absorbed into his body. From the moment he learned the sage mode, Naito didn't leave any opportunity to absorb the natural energy even when he was inside the maze. The place is vibrant with natural energy. Still, I can sense an even greater amount of natural energy inside of the mountain. Step by step through the mountain, Naito could sense clearly the increase of the natural energy inside the place. The cultivation efficiency inside of Mount Myoboku is indeed higher. The maze, combined with the interference of the natural energy, is enough to astray most of the ninjas. However, it's ineffective to Naito. Following the course of the natural energy, Naito kept heading inside of the mountain until he finally came out from the outer maze and stepped into Mount Myoboku. Naito felt as if he suddenly left the human world and entered the world of fairy tales. The maze alone was vibrant with natural energy, and entering Mount Myoboku only made it richer. There were strange giant plants everywhere. Natural energy in the place was too rich, which made even the vitality of the plants strong and affected its growth to the extreme. Natural energy was constantly absorbed into Naito's body, but the naked eye cannot see that. The amount of natural energy was even beyond his reach. After a few steps, Naito couldn't help but stop and close his eyes and focus all of his senses in absorbing natural energy. After a while, Naito opened his eyes with a hint of joy. This place can speed up my cultivation progress. It takes at least a few years or even a decade of observation to reach the second stage of the Sage Mode, the body of the immortal. However, inside this place, feeding the 5 gates of the reverse Hakimon Tonku with this great amount of natural energy will speed up the process of the blending and will naturally accelerate the transformation of the body. It's impossible to feed all the 5 gates at the same time outside of this place. At this speed, I think it won't take me more than 3 months to fill all the 5 gates with natural energy. In this case, I will need to focus only on absorbing natural energy all the time, and the 5 gates will do their work on integrating it into my whole body. After some perception, Naito determined that staying in Mount Myoboku will enhance the speed of his cultivation. Filling the 5 gates will take only 3 months, but the blending and the integration of that energy into every cell in his body will also need another 3 months. Thus the process will take half a year. This process will not necessarily achieve the body of the immortal, but 2 or 3 more times will certainly make it happen. In other words, it may take up to a year or 2 to finally achieve the body of the immortal. This speed is too fast compared to the previous decade. It got reduced by 10 times. However, there's a problem. Naito was an intruder. Mount Myoboku was the habitat of the toads, and if he wanted to stay here and safe, he needed first to talk to them. In fact, it wasn't more than a minute since he entered this place, and he could sense some of them approaching his location. Naito could sense a familiar toad approaching him. It was the one who Naruto called him Oyabun in the original. Naito could sense him from the first step he put inside the mount, but he just ignored him, yet since he decided to stay, it was impossible for him to avoid this encounter. Suddenly, there was a massive movement in the distance among the various strange plant. Under the horrible trembling of the ground, a huge toad jumped out. Gamabunta was too far away, but he couldn't help but feel confused. The flow of the natural energy is moving weirdly. What is happening? Even Fukasaku and Shima can't absorb such an enormous amount of natural energy. Gamabunta couldn't think of anyone on the mount who can absorb this significant amount, which made him feel more anxious. Once the Sage Mode is activated, the flow of the natural energy will gradually go back to normal, but this is not the case. This has never happened before. I need to check this out by myself. Gamabunta couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and without any more hesitation, he took a big leap forward. Bang! The ground immediately starts shaking the moment he took that leap. After all, his body was as big as a mountain. After jumping a few times in a row toward the direction of the natural energy flow, he came really close. Still, he couldn't feel any danger, so he fell directly to the center of the stream. Naito was standing there waiting for his appearance, but he didn't expect him to fall directly in front of him from the top of his head. However, he could see him using his ultra perceive. At that time, there was a vast black shadow on the top of Naito. If he let him land on him, Naito will simply turn into a meatloaf. Naito wasn't a fan of that idea, so before he crushes him, he suddenly flashed and disappeared. Whoosh! Obviously, Naito's speed was greater than Gamabunta's. Before he could even reach the ground, Naito flashed and appeared on the top of his head. What? Gamabunta could feel that something has landed on his head. Bang! Suddenly, with his huge body, Gamabunta landed strongly on the ground, causing the cracks to spread in all directions. Then he moved his eyes, and with his pupils, he looked up and stared at Naito. Human ninja! How did you come in? In an instant, Gamabunta determined that Naito was an outsider who didn't sign a contract with the Toads. But he could tell that wasn't any outsider after all. He could cross the maze and enter the mount, which made him kind of surprised. From the outside, Naito, who was standing on the top of Gamabunta's head, answered calmly. Gamabunta listened calmly to Naito's answer, then he narrowed his eyes. He was very dissatisfied by that answer. He already knew that he came from the outside, not to mention he felt a hint of mockery in his reply. It seems that you're here for trouble. I'll catch you first, then I will get all the answers. Gamabunta had those crazy eyes he knows of. In the original, he was known for his temper. And simply standing calmly on his head was enough for him to kill Naito. Suddenly, Gamabunta tried to jump up and fly in the air while carrying Naito on his head. But at that moment, he suddenly felt a strange force suppressing him from the top. What? Gamabunta suddenly felt terrified. Boom! Gamabunta, who was ready to attack, didn't only fail to jump up, but his whole body got stunned and crushed directly on the ground. Naito was standing still the whole time, he didn't even move a step, yet Gamabunta got crushed on the ground, and no matter how hard he struggled to stand, he couldn't. You bastard! Gamabunta had a great reputation between the Toads for his huge body and strong power. But he got simply defeated by a human who was just standing on his head. At that time, Gamabunta finally figured out that Naito was the cause of that strange flow of natural energy. There's no doubt that he's a sage. Still, his sage mode doesn't seem the same as the Toads. This sage mode, where did you learn it, human? Gamabunta, who was already defeated, couldn't help but ask Naito with a hint of jealousy in his tone. However, he was inside Mount Myoboku. He might be defeated, but he wasn't afraid. The Toads have great sensing powers, and a large number of Toads should be on their ways over here. I created it myself. Naito, who was standing on the top of Gamabunta, didn't ignore him but faintly answered his question. You created it? He looked stunned at first, then he suddenly became angrier. The way Naito was absorbing the natural energy was more violent, it looked even scary for him. His Sage Mode model seems to be stronger than the Toads. And such a strong Sage Mode, he actually said he created it. In Gamabunta's view, this was simply nonsense. Naito didn't even look old nor mature enough to create such a strong Sage Mode. You damn human! Do you think because you have this Sage Mode you can just invade our land? Gamabunta finally couldn't help but yell at Naito. At the same time, he starts to fight that strange force to move his body, since he could feel that it was fading away. Whoosh! Suddenly, he took out a huge short sword from his waist and swung it at Naito, who was on the top of his head. In an instant, the top of the sword reached Naito's body, and it looked as if it was gonna cut him into two halves. You still wanna fight? Suddenly, Naito raised his hand, bent his finger, and slammed that blade of the short sword. Compared to the blade of the sword, Naito's body was too small, and his finger is more like a tiny ant. But that simple move had an enormous amount of shock force that could kill even Gamabunta. Suddenly the sword reached Naito's finger, and a loud roar blast out. Whoosh! The power of the shock blasted out, and the huge short sword stopped just a few inches from Naito. Compared to that huge sword, these few inches are nothing. But in this situation, it seemed as if it was the distance between earth and heaven, and this short sword will never reach it. Crack! A crisp cracking sound came, and under the terrified eyes of Gamabunga, a crack appeared on the blade of his sword. The cracks suddenly started to spread, covering the entire blade. In the end, the huge sword got broken from the middle. A simple finger flicker from Naito broke the sword, the blade flew in the air, then it fell on the ground right in front of Gamabunga. It fell almost a few feet away from his head, which made him overwhelmed by cold sweat. With just a finger flicker, he broke his sword. He shouldn't have such power even if he's activating his Sage mode. This is incredible. Just as Gamabunga was so shocked that he didn't even know what to do at the moment, finally, a second toad reached over. Then there was a third, and then a fourth. Mount Myokabu was the resident of the toads, and there were so many of them, almost every one of them could sense the strange flow of natural energy. Gamabunga was the closest, so he came here first. Gamabunga, what happened? What is happening? Even your sword is broken. Look. There's a human on the top of Gamabunga. The newcomers were a bit strange, some of them were incomparably slow, others seemed to be dizzy and confused. However, their numbers were incredible, and not all of them had the same size. After they realized that Gamabunga seemed to be defeated by this human, they all surrounded Naito, and they judged him by being an enemy. How did he come in? He's not one of our contractors. He's an invader. Be careful, this guy is a Sage mode user, and it seems that he's the cause of the strange flow of natural energy. Some of them were analyzing the situation while Naito was only standing on the top of Gamabunga's head looking at them. Naito ignored all of their gazes, and casually glanced at the crowd looking for Fukasaku and Shima, but he couldn't find them. These toads weren't in charge of this place. If he were gonna talk, he would only do with the elders of this place. Human, what is your purpose of invading our land? Gamabunga finally woke up from his shock and screamed these words. At this time, he could tell that Naito wasn't a good person. Training. After he glanced at Naito, he said, training. The toads were gathering around as the two of them were talking, ready to fight. However, Naito's answer made Gamabunga and some of the others stunned. Training. Do you mean the body of the immortal? Yes, the environment is pretty suitable for practicing the body of the immortal. Naito nodded and with a calm tone, he answered. Gamabunga's expression looked awkward for a moment, then he got angry and said, are you kidding? Does he want to train here in their land? What the hell? If he were a contractor, they wouldn't mind it. His Sage mode model has nothing to do with them. It's as if he's asking someone to give him his home after complimenting it. This is nonsense. Kill him. The moment he said this word, all the toads attacked at once. Looking at this scene, Naito shrugged a little helplessly. Can't they see the gap already? Boom. 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 Suddenly, Naito flashed several times after he jumped off Gamabunga's head. After a few punches, all the toads were crushed on the ground. Naito landed back on the ground. These toads weren't weak, but they weren't strong enough to stop Naito. They couldn't even touch him. The gap was really magnificent. After defeating their whole army, Naito didn't continue to attack, but after he shook his head, he turned and looked in a specific direction. After making this big move, the elders were finally alarmed. 2 small toads were running through the jungle at this time. But the strength of these 2 toads cannot be measured by the size of their bodies. They were the sages of this land. They looked really worried as they were rushing toward the battlefield. We need to hurry before it's already over. But how did this invader cross the maze, if you weren't just too concerned about the launch? Shima looked somewhat anxious. The kids are already there, don't worry about these small matters, they should be fighting him by now. What are you saying? This is not a small matter. This is a big problem. It seems you've grown to be more stupid, Pa. Fukasaku was aware of this. He knew it was a big problem, but he just didn't want to admit that it was his fault. Moreover, it wasn't really the time to argue about whose fault is this, yet Shima was really teasing him off. And you call yourself an elder? Augh. Stop it, Ma. They didn't even reach the battlefield, and the 2 of them were fighting. Naito was looking at them with his ultra perceive from a distance. These 2. Naito couldn't help but think about Kushina. He was really worried that the 2 of them will end up like this in the future. They kept arguing the whole time until they reached the place and saw how all of the toads got defeated, and they naturally stopped. The battlefield was very messed up, and the scene looked chaotic. The toads were crushed on the ground all around the place. Some of them were shaking and trembling, others couldn't even stand up anymore. But the sure thing, all of them were terrified. They just didn't expect a human being to be this strong. It wasn't more than a second, the time Naito needed to defeat them all. They didn't even have the chance to attack him. At this time, some of them noticed the arrival of Fukasaku and Shima. Fukasaku-sama. Do not talk. Looking at such a scene, made Fukasaku's expression change. He looked shocked and in disbelief. Shima also stopped talking while she looked stunned as she was gazing around the battlefield. After they shook the status of several toads, they got relieved. They only got paralyzed by a strange force. The effect is temporary. They will be able to move again after a while. They are not seriously injured. It seems that the intruder was merciful. Fukasaku turned and looked to the distance. Then suddenly he saw a figure standing there quietly in the center of the battlefield. When he saw Naito, he suddenly widened his eyes. Ma, can you feel it? Shima also looked at Naito with a stunned expression. The flow of natural energy looks very aggressive. This guy uses a sage mode, but it looks different from ours. But I'm certain that it doesn't also belong to the Shikotsu forest, nor the Ryuchi cave. You could feel the fear in Fukasaku's tone. Just from feeling the flow of the natural energy around Naito, he could tell that he's no good news. Shima beside him nodded and said, I've never seen something like this before. The speed of the absorbing is simply terrifying. However, no matter what the cause, we must interrupt his absorption. Shima stared at Naito, then she suddenly started doing hand signs. Fukasaku nodded to her, then he started doing the same. Sage art, fire. Sage art, wind. Whoosh. Although the fire wasn't that strong, the wind release along with the use of the natural chakra made the ninjutsu stronger. The moment they saw this ninjutsu heading toward Naito, the toads behind him immediately fell back. Fukasaku and Shima's combined ninjutsu. This, for sure, will beat the intruder. None of these toads has participated in the previous battle, but for all the toads, the strength of Fukasaku and Shima is unquestionable. The scope of this attack is extremely wide, and they will get in the way if they stayed in their place. Bang! The fire was approaching the target, eating everything on its way. However, when the flame finally reached Naito, he stepped in. Whoosh! A horrible shock force suddenly blast out, as Naito grabbed the flames with his bare hands, then with one press, it got shattered. This scene shocked all the toads in the place. None of them expected a sage art technique to get beaten by Naito this easily. Fukasaku and Shima looked at this scene, and they couldn't hide their surprise, nor their fear. What? This is impossible. Both of them were widening their eyes in disbelief. Defeating their technique this easily wasn't the reason behind their shock. What really terrified them was that Naito could destroy their technique without even the need to stop the absorption of the natural energy. It's simply incredible. The Sage Mode demands a lot of focus to keep the continuity of the natural energy absorption, and the slightest movement can interrupt that. Naito didn't only move, he was actually in a real battle state, but the absorption didn't stop. It didn't even seem to be affected at all, it didn't even slow it down. How is this even possible? This guy is not ordinary. Looking at Naito has become more and more breathtaking. Right, the amount he's absorbing is crazy. How much chakra he got in his body, no one can absorb this much. Still, he's not showing any signs of discomfort. Could it be something else? Does he have the body of the immortals? Fukasaku and Shima looked at Naito with a lot of speculations in their heart. Moreover, they were more terrified about the fact that they are not able to absorb natural energy in his presence. In other words, almost all of the natural energy in the place is forcibly taken away by him. The flow of natural energy was strangely rushing toward him, and the amount they could absorb was negligible. This has been a thing that has never happened before. We need to stop, and hear what he have to say. He seems not willing to fight us. After taking a deep breath, Fukasaku gave up the idea of fighting Naito, and at the same time, he took a few steps toward him. Shima also nodded and looked back at Naito, who was also walking toward them. Strong young man, why did you come here to the Mount Moibaku? Naito could notice that both Fukasaku and Shima were no longer willing to keep this fight, so he looked at them calmly and answered. Mount Moibaku's environment is good and full of natural energies. I want to practice my Sage Mode here. Naito directly explained his intentions. There was no concealment, and there's no need to hide anything. It was clear that none of them could stop him. You want to practice your Sage Mode in here? Fukasaku and Shima looked stunned. Both of them looked at each other to find if they were having the same expression. Because he was closer to them, they could sense the natural energy more clearly around him. Natural energy looked like a whirlpool around him. The speed of the absorption made them even shocked, and when they perceived his physical condition, they could no longer hold it anymore. This is. You're practicing the body of the immortal. At this moment, they finally figured out the reason behind his ability to absorb that crazy amount of natural energy. Naito was trying to turn his body into the state of immortals by blending the natural chakra in his body cells. Instead of spending decades outside practicing it, he came here so he could absorb an enormous amount of natural energy and turn his body into the state of immortal. He knew what Naito was talking about, but his understanding of the situation made him more shocked. The body of immortals. Even though Mount Moibaku is isolated from the world, they were still aware of some major events that were happening on the outside. For example, they knew about the Warring States period and the Second War. They naturally also know of the existence of the body of the immortal. However, the people who have that strength, are generally were born with it. they just needed to develop their own strength to reach it. It's like a hidden power within them, it's not something that can be learned in a night. No one can drive his body to its limit by forcing enormous amounts of natural energy and achieve the transformation. Once you lose control over natural energy, the results will be nothing but petrifaction. However, this doesn't include Naito. He can always force the natural energy out of his body once it gets out of control, but the fact that he understands the essence of the body of immortals alone is shocking. Yes, that's right. Therefore, I need a lot of natural energy, and this place is rich with it. Naito looked deeply at Fukasaku and Shima, then he continued, so, will it be a problem if I practice it here? Fukasaku and Shima didn't answer as their forehead was overwhelmed by the cold sweat. They didn't know how to respond to Naito's request, they couldn't even refuse if they wanted, they didn't really have the choice, they didn't know how strong he was, but the strength of his sage mode is enough to crush both of them easily. Their fighting abilities fully rely on natural energy, his presence alone prevents them from absorbing it, which makes them just two ordinary little toads. We don't have the authority to decide something like this. Fukasaku stopped for a moment to take a deep breath. But when he was about to continue, a toad that was a little bigger than him jumped in. Fukasaku-sama, Shima-sama, Ojiji-sama said, leave the outsider alone, and let him do whatever he wants. Gamamaru was the oldest and most respected toad of all the inhabitants of Mount Myoboku. Because of his age, the other toads affectionately call him Ojiji-sama. He's also known as the Great Toad Sage, who lived for thousands of years and even knew the sixth path personally. What? Not only Fukasaku and Shima, but even the other toads also widened their eyes, revealing a touch of surprise. Seeing that all the toads were in disbelief, the little toad spread his hand and said, hey, these were Ojiji-sama's original words, if you don't believe me, you can ask him for yourself. Of course, they believed him, none from the toads in the Mount Myoboku will lie about something like this, and surely none will disobey Gamamaru's orders. In addition to this, what other choice do they have? Naito was too strong. His strength is almost unbelievable. If they wanted to fight him, all of them would just end up dead. In the depths of Mount Myoboku, a toad that looked very old was laying there carrying a large cup of tea in his hand. After he took a sip of tea, Gamamaru sighed. It's finally happening. The prophecy. Thinking of the thing he has foreseen, Gamamaru's eyes revealed a touch anxious. According to the prophecy, it's better if we don't interfere with him. The future, the outside world, and the human wars have nothing to do with Mount Myoboku. Mount Myoboku. Gamamaru commanded the toads to leave Naito alone and not interfere with anything he does, so the former can freely enter and leave the place whenever he wants. Therefore, Naito took place for himself in the depths of the mountain. It was a very familiar scene. The place was near a waterfall and surrounded by countless beautiful statues. However, they are actually other people who failed to learn the sage mode. In front of these stone statues, there was a small waterfall. What flows in that waterfall wasn't actually water, but a special oil that helps to absorb natural energy. Because of this waterfall, this place was the richest place with natural energy. Even the intensity of the natural energy here was better than any other place in the mountain. In the original, Naruto has also practiced his sage mode in this place, and the speed of his cultivation was incredible. So this is the special oil that Naruto used, but it looks like there's nothing special about it. Why can it attract the natural energy? Naito couldn't help but try it himself, so he put his hand directly into the oil pool. The moment he took it out, Naito could clearly feel the sudden change in the natural energy flow swarming quickly toward his hand. Naito has always been absorbing natural energy, his body was full of it, but he needed to pour that energy into his whole body before it finally flows into his second gate. Now, after he wiped his hand with this special oil, his absorbing speed didn't increase, but the natural energy that got absorbed from his hand got poured directly into the gates within his body. Interesting. Looking at his own hand, Naito gently waved a few times in the air. Ordinary people can't see the flow of natural energy, but with his ultra perceive, Naito could see everything. Whenever he waved his hand, the flow changed. Whoosh! Suddenly, Naito sent shock waves into his hand to force the natural energy out. It seems that whatever is the case, the shock force can always suppress natural energy. This scene made Naito relieved. Even with the use of the special oil, Naito can easily force the natural energy out of his body, therefore, there's no need to be afraid of getting petrified. After he cleared his mind, Naito sat cross-legged next to the oil pool and closed his eyes. The serious training has finally begun. Madara, Naito has disappeared for nearly 3 months now. Zetsu stood in front of Madara and reported the recent investigation in the outside world to him like he always does. Madara looked slightly indulged, with a glimmering light in his eyelids. He looked up and said, "It's time to start. Mount my obaku." The oil fall fell and flew through the passage toward the pool, while Naito was sitting on its edge, closing his eyes. The natural energy was gathering around Naito, forming the shape of the whirlpool, while the former was sitting in the center of that vortex, constantly absorbing it. That horrible violent flow of natural energy could be sensed in the entire mountain. It has been more than 2 months. It's been 3 months, and I've never seen anyone capable of such training. 2 small toads who feared to disturb him were watching Naito from afar. It has been nearly 3 months since Naito crossed his legs and started his training. He didn't sleep, drink, or eat anything for the whole time. All the energy he needed was directly getting extracted from the natural energy. Still, not a drop of dust was on his body. His whole body looked as if it was fused with nature. The flow of natural energy around his body was horrifying, but not for some of the animals in the place. Now and then some birds will come flying from afar and land on his head and shoulders to rest. Naito has managed to fill all of the 4 gates in his body with natural energy starting from the gate of heart, and he was working on blending that power. Even the 5th gate was very close to being filled. The natural energy was continually flowing in his body, not blending with his chakra, but directly into the 5th gate. Finally, it got filled with natural energy. At this moment, the horrible flow of the natural energy around Naito's body stagnated, and slowly calmed down, then returned to its initial state. Naito's eyelids trembled slightly, then slowly start opening. It should be less than 3 months, sure enough, the natural energy in this place is rich. Whispered softly, Naito stood up, which made the birds on his body surprisingly flap their wings and fly away. The first thing he did was stretching his body after not moving for a few months. It's not healthy even for a ninja, only immortal creatures can do such a thing. At first, he felt a little bit uncomfortable, but he quickly recovered. Moreover, Naito could clearly feel the enhancements he gained. He could feel an incomparable vitality within his body. Naito didn't forget to check the injury he gave to himself, and it looked fully healed. Naito wanted to check his self-healing ability. When he opened the 5th gate, it reached an excellent level, but now after he mastered his Sage mode, and part of the 2nd stage, the immortal body, it became perfect, still, not compared to Hashirama of course. Analyzing the situation in his body, Naito nodded. There's no need to absorb any more natural energy for the time being. After the current amount in the 5 gates get fully blended, I will need to reabsorb the same amount again. It seems that this process will take several months. After a while, Naito discovered that the range of his ultra perceive has also improved. It seems that practicing his immortal body has also strengthened his soul power. He could sense a lot of the animals, ants, and even the toads in the place since he was in the center of the mountain, although he couldn't cover the whole area in his perception. Still, he could sense the existence of a large number of them. Naito didn't have any intentions of staying in the mountain since he didn't need to absorb any more natural energy for a few months. He was ready to leave. He will wait for a few months, then he will come back and repeat the same process. This will not take a lot of time, he will just need to repeat it 3 more times, then he will achieve the second stage of the Sage mode. Whoosh! Naito suddenly flashed and appeared several times toward the exit. Currently, his moving speed looks more and more like a teleportation technique. Soon, Naito left Mount Myoboku. Before he began his training, Naito asked the toads to deliver a message back to Konoha, and since the toads and Konoha had a good relationship, they didn't mind. Jiraiya also was shocked when he learned that Naito had actually come to Mount Myoboku to practice the perfect Sage mode, but he didn't have any choice but to believe that fact. He also managed to learn the Sage mode, but he couldn't even master the first stage. Whenever he tries to do it, his body comes near to turn into a frog. When he heard from the other toads that Naito didn't have any physical changes on his body, and moreover have a stronger model than Mount Myoboku, he felt even more amazed. Initially, he also wanted to bring Minato to Mount Myoboku to practice Senjutsu. However, Minato was working on his Flying Thunder God technique and didn't have time to go. Therefore, during the time Naito was in Mount Myoboku no one came to disturb him. As for the toads, Gamamaru ordered them not to bother him, so they never dared to disobey him. All the way forward, Naito didn't encounter any obstacles. Naito quickly crossed over through half of the land of fire, gradually approaching the village. I am finally back. Kushina shouldn't be worried this time, but sure she missed me. While he looked in the direction of the village, Naito smiled slightly. Although he didn't leave for a long time, Kushina is really different from before. She became really sticky. These 3 months should have felt like 3 years to her. However, while Naito was approaching the village, he suddenly widened his eyes. What's happening? Naito speeded up while he had a very shocked expression on his face. The world was having a peaceful period, and there weren't any signs of the outbreak of the Third World War. Then why is he feeling such violent vibrations coming from the village? These kinds of powerful vibrations, there's no doubt that these are the signs of a fierce battle. Roar! The sound of the roar shook the whole place as the huge 9-tailed monster fell from the sky, slamming the ground and letting it burst. Countless ninjas from Konoha were exclaiming and screaming as the power of that slam threw most of them back. 4th team retreat. The 5th team follows me. The 3rd Hokage Sarutobi was at the forefront, wearing his war gear and holding his diamond staff in his hand, Enma. The Kyuubi who was in front of him looked mad and violently, waving his tails around and continuously roaring. Damn it, how did the seal break? We're talking about the 8 trigram ceiling here. At his back, most of the village was destroyed. Uzumaki Mai was standing beside Minato while the two of them looked extremely worried. The Kyuubi broke out. This has never happened before since the establishment of the village. because the Uzumaki's seal is powerful, and their chakra is strong enough to suppress the Kyuubi. However, this was a common thing in other villages, because they didn't have such a strong seal. However, this time, and out of the blue, the Kyuubi suddenly broke free. It seems that this accident happened very quickly, that Kushina didn't even have time to send a message to the village. After all, once the seal is broken, Kushina will be overwhelmed by the Kyuubi's strong chakra. Raw. The Kyuubi suddenly looked at the Hokage and directly attacked him with his claws. He might be big, but the Kyuubi's movement is swift. In an instant, his claws were already over Sarutabi's head, and he couldn't do anything but block it with his staff. Boom! Even with the use of the diamond staff's special ability to stretch out, the Kyuubi was still able to fight back and keep on crushing Sarutabi, until the ground itself under his feet couldn't any longer withstand that power and started bursting and cracking. HolyOniiSama. A figure suddenly flashed in and cut off the Kyuubi's claws, which made him fall from the cliff screaming in pain. It's Hatake Sakumo. Sarutabi leaped from the cracks in the ground, then shook his head. I am fine. The claws of the Kyuubi were just cut off, but his chakra surged in an instant, and new ones appeared. The demon's destructive power is extreme. The most important thing is that his body is constructed from chakra, which allows him to regenerate any part of his body infinitely. It's difficult to defeat him unless you hit him with a strong unrecoverable attack at once. After all, he's not the Hokage, the Kyuubi is much stronger. The third Hokage might be able to suppress the Hokage hardly, but it's absolutely impossible for him to do the same against the Kyuubi. There's no hope against him. Fighting him will only mean the end of the village. How can this happen? Beside him, Sakumo took a deep breath, then said, "It doesn't matter how it happened. The seal shouldn't be completely destroyed. We need to block it, and reseal it again." Yes. Sarutabi nodded, then he immediately rushed with Sakumo. This time it wasn't only Sarutabi. This time he moved again toward the Kyuubi with Sakumo commanding a group of ninjas along with him. Orochimaru, Jiraiya, and Tsunade also moved toward the battlefield. They weren't gonna watch that monster destroys their village. In no time, the strongest ninjas in Konoha gathered on the battlefield and fought against the Kyuubi, launching their strongest ninjutsu endlessly until they managed to suppress him and make him retreat. Great, we did it. The Hokage and Sakumo Dono are as strong as always, but the three Sannin are also really strong. Looking at how they managed to suppress the Kyuubi, some ninjas on the battlefield couldn't help but reveal their happiness. However, the people who actually participated in the fight didn't look that happy. They seemed really anxious. Because they knew that this was just the beginning. Raw. In a state of rampage, it seems that the Kyuubi has wholly lost any touch of reason. After being beaten by Sarutabi and the others, he became really mad. He raised his head to the sky and roared. Suddenly, a horrible amount of chakra started to surge, making the whole place tremble along with the hearts of the people who were on the battlefield. In the presence of everyone, including Sarutabi, this horrible chakra made everyone subconsciously take a step back. The amount of the chakra the Kyuubi had was incomparable to any human being. However, the strength of a ninja cannot be measured by his chakra, as we saw a lot of people in the original suppress some of the Baijua. But the Kyuubi is different. The Kyuubi was the strongest Baijua. He doesn't only surpass them in terms of chakra, but also in combat power. Under the madness of that horrible chakra, the Kyuubi opened his jaw, and a horrendous chakra ball started to form. Baijudama. The moment they saw that scene, the cold sweat started to appear on their foreheads. They all knew the goods, and they understood what that amount of chakra is capable of. This chakra. This is very dangerous. Orochimaru looked terrified and was ready to retreat. Once you get hit, you're dead. Jiraiya looked also terrified, saying, we cannot stop this one. Damn, it's time to use my sage mode, although I didn't master it yet. Tsunade clenched her fist and said, in any case, we cannot let this thing hit the village. Whoosh! The Baijudama was finally ready, and the air has become extremely heavy while the whole place was trembling as that chakra bomb getting bigger and bigger. Whoosh! Suddenly, the Baijudama stopped gaining any more mass, and without any hesitation, the Kyuubi fired it towards Sarutobi and the others. Incoming! Beware! Be sure to block this one. Everyone stood next to each other while all of their eyes were falling on that massive ball of chakra as it was flying toward them. They didn't have any choice but block it. This was a matter of life or death. At the rear, there was the half-destroyed village that suffered enough from this disaster. In the front, a dozen ninjas were standing next to each other. These ninjas were the elites of the village: Sarutobi, Sakumo, Tsunade, Orochimaru, Jiraiya. The others were just looking from a far distance at the fierce battle that Sarutobi and his followers were having. They simply weren't qualified to participate. Their attack doesn't have the slightest effect on the Kyuubi, and his destructive power will not leave them any chance to escape. They will be killed in an instant. At this moment, the Baijudama was flying over the ground heading towards Sarutobi and the other while leaving significant traces behind it. At this moment, Sarutobi and the others finally reacted. Whoosh! Bang! Boom! In an instant, they released all of their powerful ninjutsu at once, and they all flew out toward the Baijudama. Then a horrible explosion occurred throughout the battlefield. Sarutobi and the others were already at the edge of the village. They couldn't retreat even if they wanted. They barely managed to push the Kyuubi out of the village. Previously, the battle was taking action in the middle of the village, which caused them a lot of casualties, and they must not let him enter the village again. Boom! At that moment, all kinds of ninjutsu and weapons were flying over toward the Baijudama for the final clash. All of them has already used their strongest attacks. All of these releases gathered together and collided with the Baijudama, which finally caused a horrible explosion. It looked like a falling star has crashed on the ground, letting it tremble wildly. When the light caused by that explosion faded away, a huge horrible hole appeared from the dust on the field, which made everyone could not help but swallow. Blocked. We blocked it. Great, we've managed to block such a strong attack. If we keep this up, it will not be impossible anymore to suppress the Kyuubi. The shinobi in the rear has finally breathed a sigh of relief. In the front, the Kyuubi has finally stopped moving. It seems he didn't expect his Baijudama to be blocked. But this didn't last for a while. Suddenly he became angrier. Roar! He leached another mad roar, then he started surging his demonic chakra again to release another Baijudama, which made everyone look frustrated. Even Sarutobi and his followers were having drops of cold sweats on their foreheads. He's coming again. The amount of chakra this beast has is horrifying. Everyone was biting their teeth, ready for the second round. However, this time, everyone's expression looked different. They all looked despaired as all of their eyes were falling on that Baijudama. Even Orochimaru looked more pale than usual. No. We won't be able to stop this one. Damn, is this the real power of the Kyuubi? How did the first Hokage defeat him? Everyone's expression looked incredible, so shocked to even look at it anymore. How can they block it? All of them thought that the Kyuubi was just a toy in the battle between Hashirama and Madara, but now they finally realized how terrible is his power. They also understood the great power of the first Hokage Senju Hashirama. It's impossible to stop it. If Naito Dorna was here, we might have a better chance to defeat the Kyuubi if he joined forces with the third Hokage. In the distance, even the Anbu felt horrified and desperate watching the battle from afar. At the rear, Minato, who was in charge of evacuating the civilians, saw this scene and couldn't help but also feel terrified. Without any hesitation, he suddenly blinked toward Sarutobi and the others. Minato. When he saw Minato coming over, Jiraiya didn't know how to deal with him. Hokage-sama, please allow me to use the Flying Thunder God to change its direction. This sentence shocked even the likes of Orochimaru and Tsunade. You've learned the Flying Thunder God? Yes, I've just learned it. Minato took a deep breath, then looked to Sarutobi with a very confident expression. He was ready. He had just learned the technique, and he didn't develop it, nor add his methods as he did in the original. If he wants to transfer the Byakuudama, he will need to use his body to do it. He must be very precise, any mistake will mean his death. No. This is too dangerous. Sarutobi was the first to speak and refuse it immediately. It's true that he could learn this advanced technique. Still, he's too young. He might be very talented, although it cannot be compared to Naito. He definitely has the will of fire, and Sarutobi will never sacrifice him here. But there's no other way. Konoha is a large village. Even with the help of all the ninjas they cannot evacuate all of the civilians quickly. If the Byakuudama reaches the village in the back, it will be the end of Konoha. Minato, even if you can transfer this one, will you be able to do the same for the next one? Jiraiya looked at Minato and couldn't help but smile. This sentence didn't affect Minato's will, and with a serious expression he looked at Sarutobi and the others and said, "It doesn't matter what is the cost, it doesn't matter how long I can keep doing it, because Konoha is on the sake here, I will keep doing my best until the end." Well said. Sarutobi took a deep breath, revealing an expression of recognition. At that moment, he could feel it deep inside his heart, that Minato is the best successor of the Will of Fire. Suddenly, the Kyuubi released the second Byakuudama, and it was way more significant than the first one, but without any hesitation and with a firm expression, Minato flashed toward it without even looking back. Suddenly, a figure flashed in front of him which made Minato stop. "You Naito." The moment he saw Naito's back, Minato looked stunned and couldn't help but exclaim. Jiraiya was also waiting for his arrival. Still, he also looked surprised. He didn't expect Naito to come back this quickly. As early as the Kyuubi break out, Jiraiya informed Mount Myoboku to call for Naito, but they told him that he left many days before, and they cannot contact him. So he couldn't help but give up. After all, the distance between the mount and Konoha is so far away, and he wouldn't be able to reach the village that quickly. However, after they start fighting the Kyuubi, he doubted the whole idea. Can Naito even stop the Kyuubi? Before the beginning of the fight, he felt that Naito can stop him, but after he saw the real horrible power of the Kyuubi, he doubted the possibility that anyone can stop him. This is not a power that human beings can surpass. Seeing that shadow from a distance raised the hope of everyone on the battlefield. You Naito. Will he be able to defeat the Kyuubi? Naito is very powerful, his strength is incredible, this is something that everyone knows. He killed the third Kazekage, defeated the Ichibi, killed the third Raikage, and got honored as the new god of ninja. However, the power of the Kyuubi is abnormal. Even if Naito is strong, he's still human, and the power of the Kyuubi is not something that a human being can face. One tail alone has the amount of chakra compared to thousands of people. The third Raikage could barely suppress the Hokage, but the intelligence says that the Kyuubi is way more powerful than the Hokage. After all, the Kyuubi has half of the Juubi's chakra. Even the Raikage can't win this fight. Whoosh! The huge, terrifying Baijuudama smashed the void, and the whole place started trembling. This horrible chakra was extremely shocking. At that moment, Naito was standing at the forefront facing the Baijuudama. "Naito, be careful." Tsunade, who was at the back, couldn't help but shout. Her eyes revealed her worry. Even though Naito is very strong, the size of this Baijuudama was really terrible. It has the power to destroy the entire village. At that moment, even if you have some unsolved issues with Naito, you can only hope that he can block that terrifying attack. Otherwise, it will be the end of Konoha. When pain invaded Konoha, Danza didn't come out, because he wanted to become the next Hokage. Secondly, he knew that they will deal with him eventually. The Kyuubi is a mad monster that has no reason. His existence itself is for the purpose of destruction. He's a war weapon after all, and his only goal is destroying everything. If they don't suppress him soon, he will just destroy the whole land of fire. Whether it was Sarutobi, Sakumo, Danza, Jiraiya, or the others, they all had the feeling of bitterness. They knew that none of them could stop him. At the battlefield, facing the Baijuudama, Naito's expression was as cold as ever, which made everyone watching this scene feel the chills on the back of their neck. How did this happen? Naito has finally opened his mouth. His voice spread throughout the place, but it seemed too cold enough to freeze the blood in the veins. How did the Kyuubi suddenly run away? No one answered Naito's question as the Baijuudama was heading toward them. Under the horror of its approaching, everyone's expression had a trace of despair. Some of them couldn't even feel their legs anymore. There was no chance for escaping. The Baijuudama got so close, flying over toward Naito, who was the first in the line. Suddenly he stepped in, putting his two hands in front of him. Whoosh! A dazzling white light suddenly burst into the blue flames of the Baijuudama, like an orb. That light wrapped that massive chakra ball in. Under the grasp of everyone, Naito looked as if he wrapped the void itself in his hand. He kept pressing it in his hand until it got smaller, then he suddenly threw it to the sky. Bang! Suddenly, there was a big explosion along with a loud roar that shattered even the ground under them. Under the gazes of everyone in the field, Naito stopped the Baijuudama using his bare hands. The Baijuudama got defeated. Everyone looked shocked. Even Sarutobi and the other looked as if they got struck by a lightning bolt as they were frozen in their places. Did they just witness the defeat of the Baijuudama? This is impossible. They couldn't believe it, because they knew that this one was 10 times bigger than the previous one, which makes it 10 times stronger. This is not something you can face directly. However, such a huge Baijuudama got completely suppressed by Naito. What kind of power this man has! This man has never failed to shock them every time he put his feet into a battlefield. Naito stared at the Kyuubi with very cold eyes, then he turned and looked back at Sarutobi and Danza. These eyes made even Sarutobi and Danza terrified. Which one of you gonna tell me what happened? This time when Naito said this sentence, it made everyone terrified and frozen in their places. They could even hear their heartbeats raises in their ears. Even someone like Orochimaru looked horrified. The killing intent that Naito was revealing could make even a grown man piss on himself. It's like a falling strike from heaven that gonna smite them all. Roar! The Kyuubi could see how did Naito stop his Baijuudama, which made him roar in anger. The Kyuubi was waving his tails violently, and destroying the whole place as he was roaring along. Suddenly he stopped and started forming another Baijuudama. Get lost! Naito heard the Kyuubi's roars and turned to him, revealing his killing intent. Suddenly, he flashed and appeared directly in front of the Kyuubi. At this time, the Kyuubi was opening his jaws and roaring while he was quickly forming the Baijuudama. Looking at this scene, Naito directly rushed to the top and waved his hand. Suddenly a shock wave flew out and hit the Baijuudama that wasn't fully formed yet. Bang! The Baijuudama burst and its horrible power exploded in the sky, then swayed all over the place. However, the explosion was directed entirely toward the sky, which made the whole space above them crack like a broken mirror. It looked as if Naito's shockwave has wholly separated the earth and the sky into two worlds. However, Naito's attack didn't stop. As he was on the top of the Kyuubi, he suddenly used his foot to kick him. But that kick didn't look like it had any strength in it. Boom! The shock force slammed the Kyuubi down, and his roars came to an abrupt end. His huge body got pressed so hard against the ground, the tremors were so violent, which made it impossible for him to move anymore. The silence controlled the place, as everyone who was watching this scene looked stunned. Some of them couldn't help but blink several times. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were dreaming. His power is too incredible. He destroyed half of the village and fought on against the strongest shinobis in Konoha, sustained all of their ninjutsu, and was about to destroy them along with the remaining half of the village. Yet that monster got defeated by just 2 attacks from Naito. How strong is Naito? Many people know that Naito killed both the third Raikage and Kazekage, but they didn't have any accurate concept of Naito's strength because they didn't witness those battles. Now, after they saw him in action, they finally understood the real power of Naito. The Baijuudama was 10 times bigger than the actual body of the Kyuubi, still it got wiped out by Naito. He even managed to smash the Kyuubi to the ground and stop his movements. Naito's power is abnormal here. Now, can you tell me what happened? After he defeated the Kyuubi in just 2 hits, Naito stood on the top of his head, and stared at everyone present. Suddenly, the atmosphere became really cold. If it were any other Baiju attacking the village and they are having a real hard time to deal with him, Naito wouldn't even interfere, but this was the Kyuubi. And the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi was Kushina. The 8 trigram sealing style, Naito has also been studying it. This seal is so strong, that even the Kyuubi couldn't break for centuries in the original. So what was happening here was really confusing. Almost the whole seal was broken, and the Kyuubi was fully completed. There's no doubt that something is wrong. The only reason that Naito could think about is that Konoha wanted to change the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi in his absence, but they failed, and the beast broke out. Kushina meant the world to Naito, and touching her only means death. It's also clear that Naito was close to the edge, which means that he's more than dangerous than the Kyuubi himself. The last time someone hurt Kushina was when the Cloud tried to kidnap her. Naito put his anger on the whole village, destroying it and killing the third Raikage. There's no doubt that if Sarutobi is related to this accident, he wouldn't even hesitate to kill him. You Naito, you should calm down. We don't know how did this happen. Let us first seal the Kyuubi again, then find out the reason behind breaking the seal. Sarutobi looked terrified as the cold sweat was dripping from his forehead. When he heard Sarutobi's words, Naito calmed down for a moment, then he revealed his killing intent again. You don't know why. Naito was staring at Sarutobi while the veins were throbbing on his forehead. Sarutobi didn't know what to say next, so he looked at Tsunade. Although I wasn't around Kushina when the accident happened, I can assure you that none of us know what happened. The Kyuubi suddenly broke free in the middle of the village. Tsunade explained to Naito with a very serious expression on her face. After listening to Tsunade's explanation, then looked at the others, Naito determined that Sarutobi wasn't lying, and even Danzo wouldn't dare to do anything to Kushina, without discussing the matter with Sarutobi first. Because he knew that none of them would dare to provoke Naito without having a way to deal with him first. In this case, the whole accident is really strange. No one has the motivation, and Kushina didn't have any signs of discomfort. There's no way the Kyuubi could break the seal alone, someone has helped him. And even if the seal was destroyed, someone like Kushina should be still able to suppress him for a short time. Things can't happen this quickly. Naito could only think about one person who can control the Kyuubi and break him free from his seal. Uchiha Madara. Except for Uchiha Madara, there's no one who has the ability to break the seal of the Kyuubi. He also noticed that the Kyuubi didn't look like he had his conscience. The Kyuubi is not actually as violent as Konoha thinks, he's just an arrogant big fox. The Kyuubi only acts that way because he became terrified of humans after he got controlled by Madara. However, what is Madara's reason behind this act? Does he want to deal with Naito this way? Nowadays, no one can threaten Madara, nor stop his plan, he only needs to deal with Naito. If it were the former Madara, he would have killed Nagato and gone head-to-head with Naito directly to suppress him, but the current Madara didn't have any power left in him, and he must rely on that small amount of chakra to keep on living and prepare to his plan. Roar! The Kyuubi was still roaring in madness, even though he was defeated by Naito, he was still out of control. Suddenly, the Kyuubi start surging a terrifying amount of chakra trying to break free from Naito's hands, which made even the ground under him crack and shatter into pieces. Crack! Crack! Subsequently, the Kyuubi towered into the clouds, along with Naito over his head. Looking at this scene, with very cold eyes, Naito surged his chakra into the ring on his finger and turned it into a big sword. Immediately afterward, he held that sword and slammed the Kyuubi's head with it, bombarding him to the ground. Boom! Even the Kyuubi couldn't withstand that power and were crushed on the ground along with a painful roar. Obviously, Naito's attack had an effect on him. After he got hit by that sword, he couldn't recover from it for a long time. Naito didn't stop and rushed directly to the Kyuubi and cut his tails. Helplessly the former started forming a huge Baijuudama with what he had left from his chakra and fired it at Naito. Naito barehanded smashed that Baijuudama, which made everyone in the place couldn't help but swallow. So this is what it means to be called the god of Shinobi. The Kyuubi continued to struggle under Naito's feet that were suppressing him to the ground, yet he couldn't get rid of him. He felt as if he was once again imprisoned in that cage. This scene made everyone more terrified. Just when he thought it was the end, Naito moved again and punched the Kyuubi. He couldn't just defeat the Kyuubi, he needed to crush him along with his will and seal him back, so Kushina can be safe. Whoosh! The shock force was steadily spreading around the Kyuubi's body, striking him, shattering the ground under him, and trembling the whole place. Suddenly, the Kyuubi's body started constantly getting smaller, and his chakra was forcibly suppressed, and finally, he began to lose its shape. Finally, at the center, Kushina's figure started to appear, and the Kyuubi's chakra pressed back into her body, but she was lying there in the middle of the rubbles unconscious. Whoosh! After the chakra of the Kyuubi got completely suppressed into Kushina's body, Naito's rushed toward her and lifted her upper body up, then he gently pressed his hand on the seal of the Kyuubi to help to suppress it. The seal was destroyed entirely, but as long he manages to suppress the Kyuubi's chakra and seal him back into Kushina, everything will be fine. Speaking of it, there was one more strange thing. Although the seal was destroyed entirely, the Kyuubi didn't leave Kushina's body. Instead, he still used it as a container. But this is obviously a good thing. If the Kyuubi got separated from Kushina's body, she would then die since she's his Jinchuriki. In that case, even suppressing the chakra back won't solve the problem. But this wasn't the case, she was safe now. Tsunade came to Naito's side, and looked at Kushina who was in his arm, and asked, "How is she?" "She's in a temporary coma, but the seal is completely destroyed and must be resealed." Naito looked really worried. Sarutobi and the others didn't come close, they didn't dare to approach Naito in this state, even though they explained that they didn't have anything with what happened to Kushina. Especially Orochimaru, who did know Naito the most, it was evident in his heart, he could feel that Naito was 10 times more dangerous than the Kyuubi. Not anyone can get close to him, only a few people, such as Tsunade and Sakumo. When she heard what Naito said, Tsunade got relieved that Kushina was fine. Later, she looked at the seal that Naito was pressing with his hand, and she could feel that the Kyuubi's chakra could overflow at any time. "I will use the 4-symbol seal, then the 8. "No, I will." A voice came from behind. Tsunade turned to find that it was Uzumaki Mai. After the Kyuubi got completely suppressed, she rushed over. As an Uzumaki, she was proficient in seals. Naito looked at her, then he nodded and said, "Sorry for the trouble." "No, you Naito, I'm the one who should be sorry. I wasn't there when Kushina needed me the most, I feel embarrassed." Uzumaki Mai took a deep breath, then she nodded at Naito. She looked really serious, then she walked to Kushina's side and started performing the 8 seal. The perfect combination between the 4-symbol seal and the 8 needs a high level of mastery in Fuinjutsu. Most people can only perform the 4 symbols. Performing the 8 seal perfectly is more difficult, but an Uzumaki member wouldn't find it hard since they're familiar with most seals. Soon, a new seal was placed on Kushina's stomach, and the chakra of the Kyuubi was no longer out of control. The people who were watching this scene felt really relieved. In particular, Sarutobi and the others couldn't help but wipe the cold sweat on their foreheads. If something terrible happened to Kushina, no one could truly imagine the horror that Naito was gonna place on them. I think the scene where Naito slammed the Kyuubi using his hand will never be wiped from their memories. They kept checking Kushina's health, but there was nothing wrong with her, only a temporary coma. She only needed to rest for a few days, which made Naito finally calm down. At the same time, Naito looked really upset. Naito and Madara have become deadly enemies, Madara who wants to control the entire ninja world, and Naito who want to be the strongest and protect his people. However, only one person can be the strongest, there's no place for the two of them. Holding Kushina in his hand, Naito turned and looked to the village. Half of it was destroyed, and the people looked really terrified. Although Sarutobi and the others tried to push the fight out of the village got damaged, and this only proves the Kyuubi's extremely horrible power. There's no doubt that Naito is currently the strongest in the world, but he still didn't reach the level of the likes of Hachirama and Madara. In a hidden dark place underground, Madara, who was closing his eyes, slowly opened them and revealed a faint look. "It's ended. I don't doubt your decision, but I still don't understand, what's the point of doing this?" Zetsu, who was on his side, looked at Madara with a confused expression. Madara snorted, then said, "Just wait, and you will see. If you want to control someone, you will need to make him desperate first. It's all part of the plan." Konoha's temporary camp. Most of the village was destroyed, and the ninjas were working on rebuilding it, so they built some temporary camps first, so the civilians can rest in them. At this time, and in the middle of a temporary camp, some people were arguing. This kind of thing can never happen again. Danzo was standing there with a cold face, then shouted, "The Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi must be handed over to me." Impossible. Sarutobi was still against this idea. Moreover, how is he planning on controlling Kushina in the presence of Naito? "Hokage-sama, I propose to temporarily hold the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi in a safe place. We don't know how did this happen, and it might happen again." One of the shinobis stood up, then said to Sarutobi, "We need to hold its force into a special enchantment, so when it breaks free again, we can stop it easily." The shinobi said this, but none of the others said anything back. The silence suddenly controlled the place. The reason behind this silence was Naito, who suddenly came from the front door. Naito suddenly looked at the person who has spoken, then asked with a calm tone, "What do you want to do again?" Although he didn't reveal any killing intent, this simple sentence made the shinobi's heart sink in horror. Silence. No one thought that Naito would suddenly appear in the room, which made the shinobi stop talking, and the cold sweat started dripping from his forehead. The relationship between Naito and Kushina was well known. The only reason for them to call this secret council was their understanding of the difficulty of dealing with this matter. Who wants to imprison Kushina? Naito said this sentence, then gazed at the people in the room, but no one dared to look at Naito straight to his eyes. At this moment, Naito's presence was all over the place, which made more pressure on the people inside the room. Naito's presence was always strong, but after he started working on his immortal body, his presence got more terrifying. In addition, the scene of Naito single-handedly defeat the Kyuubi was still lingering in their hearts. At that moment, no one including Sarutobi dared to talk back to Naito. That's it for this video, guy. Hope you like the video. Like, share and subscribe the channel. Also tell me your recommendations in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching.